Thanks for coming along tonight, folks. We're Cheng Lei. You put this on at reasonably late notice. Makes a first visit to the Sydney Institute, and I hope it's one of many. Now, this is soon after the publication of Cheng Lei, A Memoir of Freedom, and we've got copies of that available for sale tonight, and I'm sure the author would be happy to sign them, and also Anne will advertise them on our website for our Zoom readers and others watching on the film later on. So she's well known, particularly in Australia, particularly for her work on Sky News, and in particular the recent Sky News Australia documentary, which many of us saw. So tonight I just introduced our speaker as a journalist and author of Cheng Lei, A Memoir of Freedom, and the title for tonight's talk is Surviving China, Imprisonment and Injustice. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming and to the Sydney Institute. My life-changing journey to Australia started with Sydney because in 1984, my dad was one of the first Chinese visiting scholars, and he learned English in Sydney for 6 months. So back then, it was a huge thing to go overseas. He is a researcher in metallurgical engineering, and he was living in Redfern in a $25 a week flat. He was buying Pets mints to save money. He was walking instead of taking the $6 a week bus, so he could save money and buy a big box of chocolates to send to me, his nine-year-old daughter back in China. And when I heard that we would be going to Australia, I was super excited, even though I had no idea what to expect, because the only thing Chinese people knew about foreigners was that they ate a lot of chicken. So I always told my friends at school that I would soon be, chomping drumsticks. At the time, we ate chicken maybe once or twice a year, Chinese New Year, or when there were important guests for the family, and you would just kill the family hen. But then we did come to Australia in September of 1985, Mum and I, and that was when I began, I guess, this change towards being an Australian. And to me, that first meant mastering the language. And thanks to the fact that I went to a school where there were only 3 other Asians, 1 Cambodian, 2 Vietnamese, Chinese, who one of them spoke a bit of Mandarin. And back then, if you saw somebody with dark hair, you felt you wanted to go and talk to them. And there were only 1 or 2 Asian grocers that you went to, and you just had to learn everything. And for me, learning English made me a real chatterbox, as opposed to being tongue-tied and very shy at the beginning. I was just saying to some people today that whenever I went to the tuck shop, whenever the lady said, "What flavour chips do you want?" I would be panicky because I didn't know what the flavours meant. And I would just have to try to nod at something, and invariably I always got the salt and vinegar chips. So that was a huge motivation to learn English, not just to make friends, but to try all the different flavoured chips. And of course I missed chips a great deal in incarceration, and vino and cheese. And of course the things I missed most were feeling like myself, feeling human, because part of that experience is dehumanizing. I was just a number. None of us were allowed to tell each other our names. And all the things that we humans are good at, like being kind, empathetic, sharing, having free thoughts, being gossipy, were all not allowed. There, the cardinal rule is to feel punished the number one commandment in detention is not about not stealing others' food or not having fights. It's about not vilifying the party or the leaders. So thought control is a priority. And the first phase of incarceration, as you may have seen in the documentary on Sky, is RSDL. And why they call it residential surveillance at a designated location is something I could never figure out, because what type of residence would have you sitting for 13 hours a day in a room with two people glued to you at all times? I mean, they switched every 4 hours in shifts, but you were always there and you weren't allowed to move unless you got their permission, and you weren't allowed to talk, and the curtains were always closed, and you had nothing of your own. You could do nothing. And you do this for 6 months. And for the Chinese citizens, they would be beaten up or tortured, threatened with many things. Their families would be spoken to, harassed, threatened. And how is that residential? So, having gone through that, I had already hit the worst point, the lowest point where I wanted to die. Of course, they're so safety conscious that you have nothing with which to kill yourself. The utensil you used to eat food was very soft, like a baby spoon, baby food spoon. Anything that you needed to use was brought in by the guards every shift. And when you went to the toilet, one shuffled backwards, another one followed you. So if you tried to do anything, you couldn't even take them by surprise. And I sometimes joke very darkly that only China can afford to do this, because it's so labor intensive to have these 24/7 guards who suffer just as I did, because they have to watch me do everything from sleeping to going to the toilet to just sitting there for hours and hours. And the purpose of that is to make you feel isolated, desperate, and eager to do anything to change the circumstances. And it wasn't until 10 months later that I could see my lawyer. And recently, when I gave a talk to a bunch of lawyers, they could not believe that this was what happened, and the fact that the prosecutor came to visit me much earlier, and that I had already signed many versions of confessions, which they make you write, and videotaped confessions, and you have nothing. You cannot contact anyone, you cannot talk about the case at all, at the only interaction with the outside world, which were the monthly 30-minute embassy visits, which were by video link, everyone wearing masks, so you couldn't even get the comfort of seeing a friendly face. When finally the dreaded RSDL form of torture ended and I entered what was called detention, it felt like all my Christmases had come at once, because I had cellmates. And I don't think, unless you have been through solitary, unless you have been your own torturer for that long, 180 days, that you so welcome the sight of another face belonging to someone who's in the same position. And I always said I would much rather eat slop with cellmates than be in solitary with even the best physical conditions. Because you cannot overestimate the power of human companionship. But of course, that has its downsides as well, because it is close proximity, sharing everything, no respite, everyone is stressed kind of living. And you run out of things to talk about. You run out of patience and empathy because everyone is in their own little hell. So for those 1,000 odd days, how do you rise above small minds bickering over small things? Like who dropped a bit of water on my laundry? And people even having fights, just escalating, because it's like when you go to the RSPCA and you see dogs barking for no reason because they are stressed out, and multiply that by 1,000 in this situation. So how I kept my sanity was by exercise, a lot of mental and physical discipline from the moment I woke up, which was always with Für Elise by Beethoven. And that piece of music has been ruined for me, I'm afraid. And then I would start my ever-growing list of exercises, ab crunches, squats, yoga positions, because only then can you beat the mental demons. And reading. When I was able to get books, I would almost fly away, just thanks to the power of words. And the books that we wouldn't ordinarily find the patience to read outside were so resonant with us in the cell. Books about science, where you realize that we are really nothing, that even our human history is nothing in the grand scheme of the universe. Philosophy, poetry. I had a favorite poem called To the Elwood Organic Fruit and Vegetable Shop, written by an Australian poet. And in fact, I did write to her after my release to thank the poet, because it helped me just hold those images of beautiful, fresh produce in my head. And I would say to myself, as I spooned another, very salty and terribly unpalatable spoon of onion stew into my mouth, that I'm one meal closer to real food, to eating with family, to eating for pleasure. Because when you have no images, imagery can help. I had music, even though technically we couldn't sing or do anything that was joyful in detention. We avoided the 5 surveillance cameras in the cell and the patrolling of guards and officers by always singing in a low voice and keeping a lookout for anyone coming or footsteps in the corridor. And eventually I had taught my cellmates 60 songs, ranging from Paul Simon, as I was telling David earlier, to I heard it through the grapevine. And we did get into trouble for attempting some air guitar riffs on a container lid. And I even plucked out notes by putting a hair elastic on my food container lid. And it is then that you realize when you have nothing, you actually can dig very deep, and out of desperation, out of our DNA for resourcefulness, you can create fun and entertainment. And when you see the looks of joy on your cellmates' faces, who are ordinarily, we all have resting bitch faces at all times, and this light is terrible. So none of us look very happy. But when our eyes do light up from learning the notes of an Elton John song, or being able to say something sarcastically funny about the food or about nicknames we've given the officers, it is a spark. And that is enough to tide you over the darkness. Because when you are deprived of everything, you can become like the desert flower that absorbs moisture from the air. You don't have, like we have so much at our fingertips, so much beauty and enjoyment and connection, that we sometimes lament any little misfortune. But there, when you have zero, when you do come upon a new thought, when you make a joke and you harmonize in music, then it's very powerful. And it's something that will live with you. And the ordinary Australians' kindnesses touched our cell as well. Because when I went to the embassy visits, and I always felt I was the richest in the cell, being the foreigner and having more visits than my Canadian Chinese cellmate, for example, I would bring back any tidbit, be it an open letter signed by other journalists and public figures, or a greeting from an old friend. Because my assumption was that when this happened to me, I would lose everything. My reputation was in the gutter. Nobody would be my friend anymore. I would never find a job again. And the entire world would think I'm a spy, which I'm not. But it wasn't so. And that helped. The kindnesses of, be it the Perth nun who prayed for me in their chapel and wrote to me about it, or friends who brought books via the embassy, or my kids who would tell me their latest mishaps at school. Like my daughter saying in a letter that she was at a athletics day, and she was at the starting blocks, and somebody said, "Oh, I'm terrible at running," and then she was duped, and anything that reminded me of the living world, because it did feel like we were buried alive. So when friends felt guilty about telling me how much fun they were having, I said, no, keep telling me what you're doing, because that is the why. That is my reason for sticking it out another day, for living. And when you have a why, you can find the how. So I used yoga. I made crafts out of scraps of packaging. It's amazing that the Ministry of State Security is so insecure that it prohibits almost everything. There are monthly raids where you are strip searched, and even a little plastic bag could get you into trouble. And multiple attempts by my family and friends to send me something as innocuous as a T-shirt would be disallowed. Everything is very arbitrary. And when they heard about my public love letter to Australia, that garnered so much media attention and public support. They punished me by stopping letters and books, but they lied and said, oh no, we've updated our review system. This is why you're not getting letters. But then when the Australian embassy checked with other embassies who also have prisoners there, they found that was not so. So it's all about how they see your level of cooperation. And sometimes I fear that even in free Australia, we can be imprisoned invisibly because of our trade dependence. And it is very difficult to walk that balance between engaging, and of course we have all benefited and profited from our trade with China, but not losing our balls to say, this is wrong. And I also would like to see more China literacy and more multifaceted coverage of China, which unfortunately, partly as a result of my imprisonment, has gone down. Organizations are afraid of sending lots more correspondence into China, and ordinary Chinese are now so much more indoctrinated by the CCP line that foreigners are trying to erode our stability, that they would either not dare to speak to foreign journalists or be afraid to speak candidly. So that is my worry now. But I must say, when it counted, the Australian government helped me. Right after Labor won the election in the middle of 2022, in November, there was the meeting between our Prime Minister Albanese and the Chinese President. And 3 weeks after that, I received my first and only phone call with my mum and the kids. And the Australian Embassy had been lobbying for that for over 2 years, to no avail. So again, there is this carrot and stick approach. And that's partly why we all sort of have this PTSD. If this is what happens when we upset China, then how do we avoid it? And can we sometimes go too far in the direction of caution? That is, again, something that I worry about. Even after my release, I feel sometimes I'm shadow cancelled by organizations that rely on China revenues, and the consulate and embassy still try to, sometimes behind the scenes, to get talks like this cancelled. So a big thank you to Sydney Institute for allowing me to speak freely here. And for 3 years and 2 months, I couldn't. I had no voice. Even at the embassy visits, which were every month, and they were for only 30 minutes, I could not utter a word about my case, or I would lose all visiting privileges. And the conversation was strictly monitored. I was flanked by officers, videographed, such that we did not dare speak anything about that might be sensitive. So it is a difficult beast, I find, dealing with China, and considering also that we have more than 1 million immigrants and descendants of immigrants of Chinese heritage, because some of their roots go back deep. There's a lot of fear among businesses that depend on China, among even academics that need to go back to China, and of course, people with family in China. A lot of my old Melbourne friends are too scared to be friends with me. Sometimes when there is a communal dinner and when we take a group photo, a few of them would leave the picture. And in fact, I heard today that there were Chinese students at the University of New South Wales who didn't like the fact that I was doing these talks, and I was called a monster and a clown. And in fact, how my whole experience has been from coming here as a child in 1985 when China and Australia were starting to get to know each other, for there to be people-to-people exchanges, to the 90s, and especially in the early noughties, when our trade grew, skyrocketed, and there was so much exchange. And I was reporting on all of that for the Chinese TV station at first, and then at CNBC, which is a US business network. That was, I guess, when China was keen to internationalize and engage and free up many, many things. But in the past decade, things have gone backwards. And today, when we talk about internationalization in China, it's almost a dirty word. And they now have the economic power to coerce so many countries, especially in the global south, that they don't really care about the developed world's calls for more transparency and correcting human rights abuses. So how I am seen is quite indicative of where we are in the world. In the Chinese language world, I am vilified. There are many, many untruths about me being spread. Things like my parents are uneducated, they forced me to sell out China to the Americans and the Australians, and even as specific as I leaked something on air in May of 2020, and the dirty, vitriolic comments about me I read them in order to desensitize myself, but everything from I should be skinned alive and flayed to I don't deserve to be a mother says a lot about the culture of hate. And contrast that to how I've been treated in Australia, which is I'm believed, I'm supported. When I first was released, when people recognized me on the street, they would give me a hug or tell me their stories of families being persecuted from similarly authoritarian regimes. I think we sometimes forget that we are such a kind people. And that was always what my dad said in our early years of trying to assimilate into Australian culture, that because we have been treated kindly, we can spare it for others, including strangers. And I hope that doesn't change. After all, that's what got me through a lot of the dark years. And I am so thankful that not only do I have my physical freedom, but I've been able to reclaim my voice and to tell people more about what China wants to be hidden. Because for a country of such might that it claims to have, it certainly tries to hide a lot. And much of its modern history is either erased or denied or changed. So not only is our China literacy going down, but now we also have many, many people who only see the glossy facade and miss out on the cost of the glossy facade. The people left behind, the people exploited and abused, and all the voices of dissent that China tries to quash. Yes, I suffered. Yes, it was horrible for me personally and my family, but it is nothing compared to what Chinese citizens go through, including many human rights lawyers and activists who are still jailed and harassed and threatened today. And all these invisible jails that people have within them to not say, to not even think certain things because of that culture of secrecy and punishment. So I'm super grateful to all of you for listening to my story. And in case you're wondering what it is that I had done to warrant such treatment, I can point to a few things. For example, I found out at my show trial, my 90-minute show trial, which took place 19 months after my arrest, that they started surveillance on me in April. I was arrested in August. And that was a few days after our Foreign Minister at the time, Maurice Payne, called for an independent investigation into the source of COVID, which incensed China to the extent of slapping on these extreme trade sanctions and surveillance on Aussies in China. The fact that we had identified and ousted some Xinhua reporters as Chinese spies, the fact that I had made social media posts critical about China's handling of the pandemic. There could be more reasons, because anything to do with state security in China is a state secret. So what I've been able to glean from speaking to my cellmates is that the evidence is often flimsy, and in fact they would just arrest or coerce other people for their testimonies, and it's very arbitrary. It's all dependent on bilateral relations, and of course they would say that it's never hostage diplomacy, but we can judge for ourselves. I'm open to questions.
Break for me. You want to say something here?
Yep.
So many thanks to our speaker. I mean, of all the monsters we've had here, I think you're probably the best. We haven't got around to inviting clowns yet, but we'll look out. So thanks for that. Now, the copies of the book available outside. So come back here now. And I think in the Sky News documentary, you actually also mentioned one specific occasion where you probably breached a embargo by 30 seconds or 60 seconds.
7 minutes.
Just okay, 7 minutes. Just come back and tell us about that, because that was one of the problems at the start, wasn't it?
Yes. So I was lured to work where the officers were waiting for me, then taken to my apartment in Beijing, where they raided it for hours and took away all of my electronics and bank cards. And then I had to give them all the passwords, of course. And then they found in my pile of papers on my desk, there was one government report from May. And I often think, what would have happened had I not kept that document from May, because they arrested me in August. I'm not the world's tidiest, I don't have the world's tidiest desk, as you can imagine. But then I think it would have just been something else. And the embargo time was not on this document. They coerced my, now former co-workers to say they told me it was a classified document, which is a lie, because I then proceeded to share it with the guests from outside who were in the makeup room, one of whom said he had already read it. And obviously, I pleaded to be sentenced as quickly as possible so I could go to jail, where I would get kids to visit me. Because there is no point when they want you to be guilty, you will be guilty. And they also arrested the friend who I texted the 8 words to. I signed a leniency agreement by Chinese standards, to be jailed for 5 years for sharing this, the 8 words, which, it was a document that the Premier would read at 9:30 that morning, kind of like Jim Chalmers reading out the budget. And that is the Chinese judicial system for you.
Okay, so Zeb?
Well, thank you very much for sharing this story with us. You are so brave woman. It's really fantastic to see you here and continue talking. It's very much needed. But the question I've got to you is, tell me, did you meet some other political prisoners during your detention?
It's hard to say if anyone is not a political prison in that place, because, for example, a few of them were there in cases to do with Taiwan. I heard of someone who was asked about fishing boats across the Taiwan Strait and sentenced. I heard about someone sharing a scrap of medical research information with British collaborators, sentenced to 8 years. I heard about the subsidiary, or a state-owned company's African subsidiary manager, who disclosed the amount of polluted water that the company was releasing into the local water system as per requirements, sentenced to 11 years because China was then fined. I heard about someone who got a life sentence for telling foreign journalists about an official's assets. And these are all state security or state secrets. I heard about someone who had a friend who was a Japanese diplomat, and her only crime was telling the diplomat, who then went back to Japan, that she had been told by the Ministry of State Security that he was a spy. And that would get her 5 years. So, as I was telling my friend David in the audience, information is so dangerous in China now. We're all like cattle grazing in these meadows of information, and it is very hard to know where the electric fence is, because China has broadened its scope of state security to 16 sectors, everything from the ocean to the Arctic to culture to health.
People here tonight, so we've got to be quick.
Okay. Cheng Lei, that
we'll
was...
go in here first. Yeah.
Where we go?
You.
Oh, Cheng Lei, that was amazing. But how many of those charges were trumped up like yours? And if so, what's the point? Is it just to send a message to shut, as you were describing, to shut everything down? And is it a message also to other Chinese people?
Exactly. It's a message to foreigners dealing with information it's a message to other governments. It's a message to Chinese citizens about speaking to and even being friends with foreigners. And when you are in that suspicious frame of mind, any curiosity from foreigners can make them seem like a spy, because there are so many posters and so much propaganda about foreign spies, and TV serials, and now even the stream of releases about Japanese atrocities during the war of aggression against China, all aimed at creating hate, creating in the mind these external enemies.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. You've presented, I think, arguments essentially for and against speaking out here. But what you presented today was comparable in many ways to a presentation by a Burmese academic, yes, who was incarcerated,
my good friend,
who argued that speaking out in Australia had had a very positive effect. But on the other hand, you've just mentioned the Maurice Payne situation. Would you care to elaborate on that? And given that there is a large number of Chinese students in Australian universities, what do you think, if any, their role might be when they go back to China in terms of influencing the political and civic system there?
I think we all have a role to play. When we came to Australia, yes, I experienced racism, but on the whole, we learned so much about a caring, compassionate society, a community spirit that my family tried to emulate. And it is about all of us being accepting, not alienating anyone simply because of where they're from, because we must separate the communist regime from China, the country, from Chinese people. We must take people as we find them. And our media sometimes, in the search for more clicks, can be not so nuanced in our coverage of stories. And I think, myself included, we can all do better. I think if we don't respect and give proper representation to our different ethnic groups, then they become ripe for exploitation and influence by cashed up governments.
Cheng Lei, thank you. China has a population of 1.2, 1.3 billion. The position, from what you've described, what we've heard so often over the last few years, the Chinese CCP leadership hierarchy, to say that they're paranoid about control would be an understatement. But is it in their mentality that with such a huge population, in their mentality, they think that's the only way they can keep the country together and maintain any sort of control, to be so paranoid about security? And
I think there's a couple of elements here. China, maybe 20 years ago, still similar sized population, but didn't feel like it had the position, the economic clout and diplomatic power with which to coerce other countries. I think it was more mindful of the international community and the media backlash. And in recent years, that's changed, although the wolf warrior diplomacy did get a bit too much and then it moderated somewhat. But I don't believe that it's just about the only way that works for 1.4 billion people. It's also about self-enrichment. It's about keeping legitimacy of their governance so they could rule forever. And it's much more to do with, it's not even communism, it's feudalism, it's just greed.
I've got a question here from Zoom. A reader, she's obviously read your book, and says to tell a bit more about your interaction with Australians when you were in China. I think she mentions Julie Bishop, and she mentions a Labor person. I'm not sure, she doesn't name them. So what about the interactions you had when you were working on China television?
I was there at the peak of bilateral relations. There were so many visits by our premiers and different ministers, and they would come on my show. We would talk about the opportunities for more investment, for more trade, and it seemed like things were only going to get better at one stage. But I think we were, maybe we still are in some ways, naive as to how easily we can be coerced and the extent of Chinese influence even today in our society. So we should be vigilant, but not paranoid, or to extend that to especially racist attacks or generalizations that hurt innocent people. But yeah, I honestly was quite proud of my role in bilateral relations at the time, explaining Australia to the Chinese, explaining China to the Australians.
You spoke with such poise and grace tonight, so thank you so much. You spoke also about how you found entertainment as a way to obviously keep yourself mentally resilient. What were some of the other characteristics that you learnt about yourself in that period, and what are the things that you're now, I guess, embracing in your life on this side?
I went through a period of hating myself, hating my profession, hating my former life, because it seemed very shallow. It was glamorous, yes. I met these crazy rich, crazy powerful people, and I guess reveled in that. But what did it say about me? What did I learn? Who was I? And when all that was stripped away, when I had to sit naked in a cage, when I was day to day, no makeup, had never seen a mirror in all those 1,154 days, and had no technology or connections, I found security at the core. I knew that I was a good person, that I love making someone smile, making their worries go away. I stick up for my mates. When there was punishment, I would rather take it myself, because as a foreign citizen, and also someone who had a bit of profile outside, I would be punished less harshly. I knew I was very creative. When the cell got too hot, I used the potato stew to mash between a bit of plastic and tried to make chips on the floor. Not very hygienic and a bit chewy, but it was worth a try. I tried to do calligraphy on the concrete floor, just using my slipper, my shoe, and a bit of water, and that I could rise above all the pettiness through books. And I still had it in me to make up stories and write funny anecdotes to my kids, because I knew I had to be healthy and strong and well-adjusted for when I eventually saw them. So It was a difficult journey, but it's made me today, I think, a better person. And I love the fact that I can talk to all of you, because in those months of solitary, I really longed to speak to anyone and see a smile. So, very grateful. I have an anecdote about appreciation. Because of COVID and the fact that there were some elderly inmates at the facility, we were allowed one hard-boiled egg every Thursday morning, and that was, the best breakfast of the week. So one week they forgot, and we were ultra disappointed. No egg on Thursday. What's there to live for? And then moments later, the door opened, and there were 2 eggs left over, which they cut into 4 halves and gave us half an egg each. And all of a sudden, we went from devastation to elation. So I guess the moral of that story is, when we do have 1 egg, appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was extraordinary. I'm almost speechless. Do you see any possibility of a regime change in China? Are there any underground movements? Are there people there who see all the problems and are trying some way to change things?
The trouble with China is the size, the complexity, the contradictions, and I am always trying to observe or trying to read the situation, which in some ways it's easier outside and in other ways it's harder. So I do know that there are dozens of protests a year, many of them about collecting wages, and the local governments are keen to not have them escalate. I know that online censorship has hit unbelievable levels, just pages and pages, thousands and thousands of words that you cannot mention. And I know that overseas there are many, many people who would like a regime change, who are working on, for example, some of the June 4th, Tiananmen Square activists are trying to work on a blueprint for what happens if there is a regime change. We also know that the CCP membership has exceeded 100 million. We also know that means many, many more vested interest holders who would like to preserve the status quo. We know that the Chinese economy has shown amazing resilience. And with all that, what do? I guess we can influence things in a positive way by continuing to accept and inform our, the Chinese overseas students who are here. We can uphold our own integrity, because right now, anything that's eroding Western democracy is doing wonders for Chinese propaganda. I'm also an avid follower of China's version of Quora, a Q&A community, where most of the, I guess, more well-educated and worldly and less nationalistic Chinese go. And I'm pleased to say that when you go there and look at all the answers in the comments, when it comes to questions like Taiwan invasion, or questions like Lan Lan Yang, the Rolls-Royce driver in Sydney, or like the stream of anti-Japanese invasion kind of rhetoric, you see very, very sensible answers, and thousands of sensible answers. So, as usual, it's like predicting an earthquake. Which grain of earth will move to the cataclysmic movement? We don't know, but we can try to accumulate, the grain of sand in the right way.
Just a final question. you're now reading Sky News Australia from Melbourne, I think, in the afternoons.
And sometimes from Perth and Adelaide and Brisbane, wherever Canberra and Sydney.
Whenever you are, but any plans for another book? Well, what's the future now? I mean, you're very well known in Australia. You're an author. You're a commentator. You're a newsreader.
I would love for there to be wider and deeper coverage of China. I worry about our drop in China literacy, and we have many people with polarized views, China bulls, China bears, panda huggers, China bashers, and it keeps us from having really intelligent and considered conversations about how we deal with China. So what form that will take, I don't know, but I'm full of energy and fearless.
So Fearless Monster, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And for a great talk tonight and for your great courage, which is evident even in the early pages of the book. I mean, you're a woman of enormous courage and I must say very tough. Well, there you go. Okay. So, copies of Cheng Lei's The Memoir of Freedom are here tonight, and I'm sure we'll have you back sometime in the future. Well done.
Thank you.